Hi, folks. Today we're talking about race ultimately as an introduction to our course, Race and Ethnic Relations. And by beginning with respect to talking about race, we're ultimately looking clearly at definitive defining characteristics. Well, what ultimately is a race? What does it consist of? What are racial groups? That also allows us to delve into the subject of ethnicity and ethnic group as well. As we begin, terminology again, we're talking ultimately about race and the definition of it. So, by race, we're talking about a group whose members share or have socially defined biological features which distinguish them from other groups in society. And so we have to break that down. And so, again, we're talking about socially defined, socially determined biological features. And so, what ultimately we're saying is that any given society decides which physical features constitute or make up racial groups, categories, and boundaries. And so, that ultimately tells us and lets us know that race is a social construction. So, racial categories, they grow out of social definition, not out of biological ones. Again, if you go from one society, one culture, one nation to another, your race or racial groupings could change going from that one place to another simply because each of those respective places has a different way, its own way of defining what racial boundaries and racial categories really are. And so societies ultimately choose and have chosen which physical features make up boundaries. And so often we're talking with respect to U.S. history and U.S. social history, we're talking in a lot of respects about skin tone, skin color, hair texture, eye shape, as supposedly, purportedly being defining characteristics of races. But if you go to another country, you go to another part of world geography, again, the racial group or classification that you may fit into or your family could fit into, family members, could change in as quickly, as shortly as a plane ride. So again, we're talking about socially determined, socially defined biological features. Again, society deciding which of these is important, which of these are significant for social reasons. So keep in mind also biology as a science and biological comprehension of human anatomy developed generally after racial categories and groups were created. So also with that, research shows that there's more variation within racial groups, not between racial groupings. So think about that for a second. Again, we developed race and racial categorizations well before we learned about germ theory, we learned about DNA, and basic biological and anthropological underpinnings of physical science and how they actually relate to human beings. So, again, racial ideas came first, and then what we learned about human anatomy, that we're all Homo sapiens, that came second. Right? So within that, we have to keep in mind that race is a modern idea. So race, racial groups, these ideas have largely existed for only about the past 500 or so years. All right? And again, if we're looking at the annals of human history, very, very recent developments, very, very modern ideas with respect to what race and racial categories and groups actually are. So, again, that modern idea over having developed over the past 500 or so years had nothing to do with consultations of anthropological or biological considerations of human anatomy, physiology, or anything therein. The categories were developed, they were developed socially for social reasons, in ways to create hierarchies, statuses of groups that ranked in terms of power, different levels of power, and different levels of subordination. Also, there's a lot of variety here that racial groups, racial categories in society change from time to time and from place to place. So this also further underscores the status of race as a social construction. So for instance, in Brazil, if we look at that country, black is used to identify those with no traceable European ancestry, whereas at least 80% of African Americans here in the US have some European ancestry, and at least 20% have Native American ancestry if we're looking at the African American population. So again, how Brazil looks at things varies, again, considerably from how things are looked at and codified with respect to race here in the United States. Now to talk a bit about ethnicity or ethnic group, and so you'll often find those used sort of interchangeably with each other. So with ethnicity, we're talking about a shared cultural heritage. So we're talking about a group whose members have culture as a common theme and bond between the members of the group. And that culture, that cultural heritage that they share, is often based upon a nation or a country of origin, such as Polish American or Mexican American, for instance. The very nature of racial categorization, however, and racism combine, they conjoin to create culture for groups such as African Americans. So these groupings often form the basis of ethnic enclaves in major cities and major metropolitan regions. Obviously, with this notion of race, going back to race being a social construction, there are inherently incredible challenges. Think about it. It changes from time to time, from place to place. So even within the country, one country we're looking at, again, how we classify, how we group, and how we discuss and ultimately define racial categories changes. We've done that. We've seen that here in the United States. And again, think about our Brazil example compared to the US. And so that makes it difficult because it's real socially. It's not real genetically or biologically, it's real socially. And so that's what makes this very, very difficult. We've said that these physical attributes matter. And again, we say that they matter. That process in saying that they matter is a social process. There's nothing inherently different biologically about white folks, black folks, Asian folks, Native American folks, or Latin American folks, Latinx folks. So when it comes down to it, there's no inherent difference physically, but we've said socially that these differences matter. So that is problematic in and of itself, right? So as a social construction born out of social definition, it's inherently problematic. Again, there are more physical differences within races rather than between, and again, the same is also true for biological differences. Racial categories often have a connotation of being pure, where each member of the group is assumed to be one race only, when in fact most people of color are a mix of various ancestries, and therefore they are also a mix of supposed or purported racial backgrounds, right? So often people are assigned to race on very arbitrary, illogical grounds. For instance, if we look at our white ethnic population, if we look at Irish Americans, Italian Americans, American Jews, when they initially immigrated to the United States during the mid to late 19th century, they were considered non-white. Again, due to the negative connotations that were inherently socially constructed and ultimately projected onto members of such groups. Persons of Middle Eastern and North African descent have traditionally been classified as white by the U.S. Census and the U.S. government, whereas such a label is overwhelmingly rejected as meaningless by members of these ethnic groups. So again, someone coming from nations, again, from the Middle East, from North Africa, they may say, this is how the U.S. classifies my racial heritage and background. However, they think of their ethnicity and their culture often mattering a lot more than whether or not they fit into a racial group, and certainly not one that defines them as white. We also have to talk about the history of the one drop rule. And so historically, the notion is with this one drop rule, this is something that is a patterned long-standing practice with respect to the social history of African Americans and the social history of racial groups. Ultimately, the one-drop rule meant that at least one black ancestor one drop, if you will, of black blood makes a person entirely black and unable to claim additional ancestry. This practice developed in the South during slavery to effectively maintain the largest possible class of slaves and therefore enslaved people, ensuring a perpetual laborer class, and it was violently enforced. So regardless of what we sometimes know as phenotype or call phenotype, regardless of how one supposedly looked to others, if they had an ancestor of African descent, that person was considered black no matter what. So that's what the one drop rule ultimately gave us the legacy of. While today it's not the rigid standard that it used to be, the tradition of that one drop rule and the severity of its implementation influences many people of mixed ancestry to today consider themselves as black. We also have to realize and confront the reality that race is a pseudoscience. Today we know that the American Sociological Association, the American Psychological Association, and the American Anthropological Association, they have all taken official positions rejecting biological explanations of race. So again, overwhelmingly, we know that race is a social construction. Within that, though, racism exists. Racism is real. Again, if we consider something as real, it will be real in its consequences. And again, so we're looking at something that's, while not biologically or genetically real, socially race is real. And again, racism is right there accompanying it. That we're talking with racism about prejudice and discrimination directed at people of color. That has material effects, real effects in housing discrimination, in the legal process, in our policing practices, in how we educate and teach, in how we treat workers in the workplace with respect to workplace discrimination, and many more other domains of our society that we'll be talking about this semester. Also, we have to consider race as a process of racial formation, and a lot of this comes out of the great work of Omi and Winant. So race as racial formation gets us to realize that race involves the development of unique individual minority status racial groups that have suffered under oppression of whites. This process is a social, political, and historical one that involves culture, subculture, and the role of institutions in our society. Racial formation is an enduring pattern. It's ongoing. It produces racialization, minority, and dominant groups within society. All right. We also need to talk about how racial categories have been maintained and how they persist over time. And so we'll look at various ways. Obviously, with, if you will, respect to social history, slavery being the main one. African Americans and selectively members of other groups were reduced to property and the extension of the whims of white slaveholders, politicians, among others, who denied them basic rights and dignity for over 250 years. Such efforts ensured all social institutions, including the family, were dominated by whites and restricted non-whites from access. Upon the ending, if you will, demise of slavery, we had the rise of Jim Crow and legal forms of segregation, this occurring largely after the Civil War and Reconstruction. So these legal systems of segregation, Jim Crow in the South, and we also in the North had restrictive covenants, among other ways, if you will, where, again, the separateness of African Americans from whites and other groups was largely codified. So again, this legal segregation Jim Crow process created and maintained separate but equal, supposedly separate but equal, physical and social spaces. So we're looking at parks, recreational facilities, housing, neighborhoods, and public facilities. Separate but supposedly equal. Again, these were legal standards separating whites versus African Americans, Latinx folks, Native American folks, again, whites from folks of color. Some laws went even further, barring, for instance, African Americans from state residency, as in the case of the state of Oregon. This was rescinded, and again, we're talking about the the mid-rather 19th century. Although this was rescinded in the state in 1854, the legacy of racial hostility it represented remains, as Oregon, the state, is just 2% black today. Another way that racial categories and these ethnic categories were ultimately maintained within and by our society throughout its social history is through citizenship and who could become and expect to have rights as citizens. So commonly employed by the U.S. government towards Asian Americans prior to World War II, these laws prevented many Asian Americans from becoming citizens, owning property, or marrying whites. Marriage was another way that we maintained and allowed, if you will, racial categorizations to persist or to continue. So with respect to marriage, we had so-called anti-miscegenation laws. These were passed in several states, dating from the 1660s to just into 1967. When the U.S. Supreme Court struck down such legislation, again, the impact is severe. You have to consider how long these anti-miscegenation laws were on the books. The vast majority of marriages during this time occurring in our country were intra-racial within the same race, despite significant increases in interracial dating and cohabitation since the 60s. So where we tend to see more interracial relationships is those that are short of marriage, much more likely to be dating and cohabiting relationships, although we've seen increases in the percentage of interracial marriage as a percent of all marriages. Again, most marriages today are intra or within the same racial group. Obviously, plain old discrimination was a way that racial categories were maintained and persisted. So we're talking really about two types, and a lot of this also harkens back to what we were saying about Jim Crow and legal segregation. So we had two types, two approaches, if you will, to discrimination. They can be described as de jure and de facto. So de jure levels of segregation or de jure forms were those by law. So laws that were written in place to separate and discriminate, if you will, between racial groups. And de facto, these are forms of discrimination and segregation that are by practice, what most people would actually do. So although de jure forms, legal segregation is outlawed today, again, the legacy of that has largely lent itself to de facto forms of segregation, particularly in terms of where we go to school and send our children to school, as well as where we live residentially. So the overwhelming amount and pattern of legal de jure segregation in place throughout the nation's history has shaped social behavior today to fit much of the old legal patterns in housing, education, law, criminal justice, and health. Immigration, that was also another way within which we maintained and persisted racial categories. Barriers to entry to the United States have been strictly enforced, effectively barring people of color from entering the country en masse via quota limits and acts such as the Chinese Exclusion Act and the War Brides Act. Expulsion was another way. Generally directed towards Native Americans, policies enacted to forcefully remove or restrict minority group members were employed throughout U.S. history, from the use of sundown towns, and we'll learn more about those, sundown towns, as well as the coerced removal of Native Americans from the eastern United States to reservations in the West via the Trail of Tears and or treaty abrogation. So we're looking at with treaties with respect to Native American tribes and nations having been broken again and again and again. And that's what we are ultimately talking about with abrogation. Certainly violence and forms of violence were used to maintain and persist racial categories. The vast majority of American racial acknowledgement and identity has occurred in close association with generally organized violence meant to intimidate and threaten minority presence and participation in white-dominated institutions such as workplaces, housing, public places, and neighborhoods. These often took the form of protests and violence against black residents, murder, for instance, the murder of Vincent Chin in Detroit in 1983, which prompted the development of Asian and Asian American studies on college campuses, and lynching, the murder of African Americans and Latinx persons by angry white mobs. All right, so that gives you a sense of how we got here, how we are at where we are in this point in U.S. social history, how, again, racial categories were effectively maintained and how they persisted throughout time. We also have to talk about the systems of inequality that have allowed this to be produced and to be reproduced over and over again. And so with that, we're talking really about systems of stratification and inequality. Now, stratification is a very important concept to sociology. And again, we're talking about, with stratification, the layering of inequality within our society, the hierarchical, if you will, the ranked organization of society that can be described as strata or layers. So if you think about, in a geological sense, you've got strata or layers of rock, for instance. Again, stratification refers to the layers of inequality in our society, sort of the ranking of, if you will, the population in terms of who has the greatest amounts of power, prestige, and wealth, so to speak. And so the layers of inequality in our society, there are many, both within and between social classes and racial groups. And so a lot of what we're talking about, even though we're weaving in social class stuff, is inherently related to race and ethnicity and culture therein, because we're talking about systems that are intertwined. And so the layering of inequality directly ties into race and ethnicity in terms of who is ultimately subordinated and layered at the bottom of society historically. Now, with respect to inequality, we're also, again, talking about social class. With a social class, we're talking about a large group of people in our society who have similar levels of wealth, power, and prestige. And so typically within sociology and for sociologists, we distinguish the upper class, the middle class, the working class, and the lower class. We also tend to see stratification in addition to stratification by race and ethnicity and culture. We also see it with respect to income and wealth. With income, we're talking simply about wages one earns from work or investment. With wealth, we're talking about something different. With wealth, we're talking about assets minus debts, what you own minus what you owe. And so what we'll see is that there are, again, layers of inequality between whites and folks of color in terms of income earned by individuals, income earned and shared by households, but also there are tremendous real differences in wealth over time, especially into the present, between whites and folks of color. Also, with respect to stratification, we're talking about power and who has power in society. So with that, we're looking at the ability to assert and exercise one's will on others despite opposition. So within that, just think about that. There are clearly significant differences in power that exist from one social class to another, and again, from one racial group to another. Again, we're talking about the layers of inequality within our society. We also see differences in terms of prestige, the amount or respect given to a person, often in relationship to their career, their title, their family of origin. Ultimately, when we look at those who've had the higher, greater positions of power and prestige and wealth and income, we're looking largely at white folks with respect to the handing down and passing down of that privilege from one generation to the next.